Gospel of John. Last week we kind of did an overview, an intro, of the fact that John is so different and why. And in this week you're going to feel it. Because John chapter 1 starts off in a whole different way. In a whole different way. I mean, here's how it could have started. It could have started with the genealogy of Jesus. Right? That means a lot to you, doesn't it? No, it doesn't really mean a lot to you. And that's... didn't mean a lot to the readers of John. So he didn't start there. Could have started with John being a descendant of... Jesus being a descendant of David. Right? That means a lot to you, doesn't it? No, probably not. Unless you have the Jewish background, it probably doesn't mean a lot. Matter of fact, if you were in the world of John's recipients, the people that John was ministering to, and you talked about this guy named David that was, way back then in this little piece of ground that was called Palestine, and all the great things he did, and all the... It just wouldn't really have that kind of to it. I mean, how does David compare to Alexander the Great? How does David compare to Pompey? How does David compare to Julius Caesar? Okay, so you get the idea? It just, probably just wouldn't just stir your heart. So he didn't start there. Because those are things that, unless you were raised in a Jewish background, unless you were raised in a synagogue with your knowledge of the Old Testament, just don't call to you. And some of you have been going to Sunday school all your life, and it still doesn't call to you. So John starts completely different. He goes back to Genesis. Remember what the word Genesis means? Beginnings. He started in John chapter 1, verse 1. He says, in the beginning was the... and here's a really strange word to translate. The Word. There are a couple concepts that just don't come across in translation. And this is one of them. And this is what we struggle with in English. The Greek word here is logos. I remember that from my childhood because there used to be a Christian bookstore called Logos, right? And I found out that meant word, and oh yeah, it's my first Greek word I knew. Wow, okay. It is a huge concept behind a little word. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And he was with God in the beginning. Separate and together. The Logos and God. Right? The Logos we translated word. It could also be translated reason. It is a Greek philosophical idea. All packaged into one little word. And we have to struggle with this a little bit to find out where John is starting. You see, the Logos in the Greek mind goes back 5 centuries to a person that was in Asia Minor around Ephesus where John is when he's writing this. Who talked about the reason that patterns the world. The power that keeps the world going. One famous statement he had was that the world was in flux. He says, like stepping into a river. You step out, you can never step back into the same river. Next time you step in, it's a completely different river, isn't it? It's all changed. It's all gone by. He said that's what life is like. And it would be chaos, it would be disorder, except for this idea of this reason, this logos, this power from God that directs it all, that gives it purpose. That's where John starts. In the beginning was this this logos, this power, this reason. We use the word because, well, we don't really have anything else for it. But even in the Jewish context, this makes so much sense. You go back to Genesis chapter 1. How did God create? God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God said, "Let the waters divide from the land," and the waters divided from the land. How did He create? With words. He said. Later on He said, Genesis says that God said, "Let us make man in our own image." That really confusing plural. Let us make man in our own image. Read John 1, verse 1 again. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And in verse 2 He says, "Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made." He was there for creation. He was in Genesis chapter 1 when God said, and that's the power, the reason, the logos of God. The logos. Amazing concept. With four little letters. The Word. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God. The Word was God. Let us. Remember Genesis 1 says, "And the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters." We started this series about the Spirit on Wednesday nights, and we dealt with that passage. The breath of God, the wind of God, the Word of God. He says, He was God. He was with God in the beginning. He was part of every part of creation. There wasn't anything He missed out on. In other words, He wasn't created. He wasn't created. It wasn't like God created the Word first and then the Word created. That's not what John said. John said He was part of every part of creation. In the beginning, He was there. He was with God. He was God. The reason, the power of God. It says here, "In Him was life. And that life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it." What a nice way to begin a story about Jesus. Because, for those of you who are very familiar with it, if you jump down to verse 14, He says, "The Word became flesh and lived and made His dwelling among us. And we have seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Father, the only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." All these huge concepts. In Him was life, and that life was light. And we've seen the glory, and the glory was full of grace and truth. Now, do you remember some of your philosophy classes? Do you remember taking on these concepts and philosophy? You know what a philosophy is? Philosophy is basically your worldview. Things that shape the way you look at events and say, this is why this happens, this is why it doesn't happen. This is what we're supposed to do with this when it happens. This is how I'm supposed to react to this. Philosophy, your worldview.